This is Standing Watch. And now, Evangelist Norbert Link.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to our Standing Watch program. In regard to the State of the Union speech by President Biden last night, the New York Post published the following editorial this morning. It takes a special sort of political cynicism to publicly thank the Ukrainian ambassador for her nation's bravery and stress in the next moments that we will do nothing to defend her country with our military. But then President Biden's State of the Union speech was nothing but bumbling hypocrisy. Start with the fact that the mask mandate Nancy Pelosi lorded over her members for years was suddenly lifted the day before the speech, showing that follow the science was a bald-faced lie. Next up, Biden begging for unity, then accusing Republicans of only helping the rich. It was quite the performance. He got cheap applause for claiming he was going to get businesses to stay in the United States. This after Democratic administrations have signed trade deal after trade deal that have taken industries to China and Mexico. Meanwhile, nothing on energy independence, which would help our economy and strengthen our foreign relations. Meanwhile, Art Doddering Joe said he stood with the Iranian, not Ukrainian, people, and assured everyone he wouldn't be fighting Ukraine, not Russia. He insisted we should fund the police after Democrats used defund the police as a rallying cry for more than a year. Joe's plans boiled down to nothing more than just get it done, a phrase he said about 153 times. Pass my bills, just get it done. Cure cancer, just get it done. None of it will get done. It was an unserious speech for deadly serious times. Lord help us. Now, I listened to the speech live, and I subsequently got myself a transcript of the speech, and I would have to say that President Biden made quite a few controversial statements. Now, some wouldn't have been controversial per se, but they were because President Biden said them. Of course, he left out many areas pertaining to the economy, inflation, recession, rising costs, supply chain shortages, and so on, which Americans were most interested in. What I like to do now is to go through some of his statements and add my comments to them. He said, throughout our history we have learned this lesson. When dictators do not pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos. I wondered, was President Biden speaking to himself and about himself? He went on. We spent months building a coalition of other freedom-loving nations from Europe and the Americas to Asia and Africa to confront Putin. Now, if that is true, if they spent months doing that, why was Biden so terribly unprepared when Putin invaded Ukraine? Continuing. And tonight I am announcing that we will join our allies in closing off American airspace to all Russian flights, further isolating Russia and adding an additional squeeze on their economy. But nobody wants to consider President Zelensky's request of a no-fly zone in Ukraine, preventing Russian aircraft from using Ukrainian airspace, as this, so NATO, would mean a declaration of war on Russia. And that is also why NATO prohibited Poland and other European nations to send some fighter jets to Ukraine. Stoltenberg said, NATO is not going to send troops into Ukraine or move planes into Ukrainian airspace. The same kind of appeasement is going on. The same kind of avoidance of consequences is going on, as it did go on under Hitler. Continuing Mr. Biden's speech, he said, "Let me be clear, our forces are not engaged and will not engage in conflict with Russian forces in Ukraine. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight in Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies in the event that Putin decides to keep moving west." Now, he announced this before, that NATO American troops would not fight in Ukraine, thereby opening up the doors for Putin to march in, knowing, okay, well, I don't have to battle then with the United States, with NATO, with all these countries. Let me also say in passing that some have suggested that Putin is doing these things because God is directing him to do that in order to fulfill biblical prophecy. That is a false assessment. It is not God. It is Satan who is inspiring Putin, perhaps even possessing him himself to do these things. So we have to keep those distinctions clearly in mind. Continuing now with Mr. Biden's statements. "As I have made crystal clear, the United States and our allies will defend every inch of territory of NATO countries with the full force of our collective power." But here's a question. Would the United States, would NATO in fact really engage in military conflict with Russia if Putin invades a NATO country, which is entirely possible? Mr. Biden went on, "A Russian dictator invading a foreign country has costs around the world. And I am talking robust action to make sure the pain of our sanctions is targeted at Russia's economy. And I will use every tool at our disposal to protect American businesses and consumers." Translation. The import, the daily import of Russian oil and gas in astronomical amounts is still ongoing, which is paying Russia and Putin what he needs in order to finance his war. Now, how they are going to do this since they knocked off Russia from SWIFT, I don't know, but those transactions are going to take place. Mr. Biden said, "We meet tonight in an America that has lived through two of the hardest years this nation has ever faced. The pandemic has been punishing." No, not the pandemic has been punishing. The restrictions imposed by the government have been punishing. "It fueled our efforts to vaccinate the nation and combat COVID-19. It delivered immediate economic relief for tens of millions of Americans." Now, how did forcing Americans to vaccinate deliver economic relief for tens of millions of people? Mr. Biden said, "And unlike the $2 trillion tax cut passed in the previous administration that benefited the top 1% of Americans, the American Rescue Plan helped working people and left no one behind." Now, of course, this caused a lot of objection by the Republican audience. And, of course, Mr. Biden made this claim before, for which the Washington Post gave him 3 Pinocchios, saying this is a complete falsehood. It's a lie. He went on to say, "We should all agree, the answer is not to defund the police. The answer is to fund the police with the resources and training they need to protect our communities." It was a Biden administration. It was the very vocal Democrats who were advocating to defund the police to begin with. He then said, "And if we are to advance liberty and justice, we need to secure the border and fix the immigration system." Now, this was probably the biggest joke in the entire speech, given the fact that his policy of opening borders and inviting everybody in created an immigration disaster. So much so that the INS is completely, totally backlogged, unable, incompetent to deal with legitimate requests, because they got to deal with this mess caused by the Biden administration and the president. He went on to say, "The constitutional right affirmed in Roe v. Wade, standing precedent for half a century, is under attack as never before. If we want to go forward, not backward, we must protect access to health care, preserve a woman's right to choose." Translation: we must preserve the woman's right to murder her children, with the help of complicit doctors and politicians. He then said, for the LGBTQ plus Americans, let's finally get the Bipartisan Equality Act to my desk. The onslaught of state laws targeting transgender Americans and their families is wrong. As I said last year, especially to our younger transgender Americans, I will always have your back as your president, so you can be yourself and reach your God-given potential. Well, God doesn't approve of those alternative sexual practices. As long as people engage in those practices, they will not achieve their God-given potential. And then Mr. Biden said our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan faced many dangers. Now, though I was hoping he would at least say a few words about the disastrous decision he made as to how to withdraw the United States troops from Afghanistan. Not a word was uttered. Not a word was mentioned. No apology, not even any reference to this terrible decision of his. And finally, he said, we have fought for freedom, expanded liberty, defeated totalitarianism, and terror. But it was Biden's corona restrictions which have limited freedoms and liberties, and they have to an extent advanced totalitarianism. And so what did the New York Post's editorial say at the very end? Lord help us. Indeed, God help us. Because if nothing else, the speech last night, which was to a large extent quite boring to me, but it overall showed and manifested that the downfall of the United States of America is inevitable. Now, it has been prophesied, it's going to happen, and we are seeing it happening right now. Our booklet, The Fall and Rise of Britain and America, shows you how it's going to happen. This booklet is yours, free for the asking. Thank you very much for listening. This is Norbert Link for the Standing Watch program.
Standing Watch is a presentation by The Church of the Eternal God, P.O. Box 270519, San Diego, California 92198. More information is also available at our website, eternalgod.org.